I'm going to read some of the stuff he read, that he wrote.
Sale, vamos a ver.
Diego. No sé por qué no sale aquí el video. Vamos a ver qué es.
Andy. Andy, do you hear me?
Ellos están viendo qué es.
Andy, do you hear me?
Hey guys.
Mute.
Andy,
Andy, mute everybody.
Mute everybody. I am. My daughter's helping me.
Yeah.
Hi, Christy.
Everybody, smart.
There she is.
Andy,
Because when
you
you
ask
mute
everybody
the young
better.
people, you can.
Andy, everybody else has to mute.
mute
Yeah,
everybody.
we're muting all. Don't worry.
I muted everyone.
Now you guys can hear me and I can't hear you. Give me a fingers up. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we muted everyone. You want to stay like this.
Can you guys hear me? Give me a finger up so I can see it. Pedro, dame un dedo. You can hear me. All right.
Hola, ¿qué tal?
Oh, there we go.
So let me start early. I have to tell you, a couple of weeks ago, my friend Marielena Villamil came up with the idea of maybe you should teach a course while we're all in the middle of this COVID pandemic. And I said, well, let me put it up on Facebook and see what happens. And the response was unbelievable. Actually, I have to tell you, I got, as of this morning, 252 responses. And of course, Zoom only allows me, as you know, 100 participants. So I'm recording it and putting it up later on for people to see it. And again, let me begin by apologizing because we're only going to do this for 40 minutes since it's the period that they give us, and then we'll see where we go after that. I hope everybody is safe and healthy during this pandemic. It certainly has changed everybody's life. Let me tell you, I'm really honored that I have this opportunity, and rather than lecturing, I hope to have a chat with you and inspire some thinking throughout these 4 sessions that I'm going to have with you. Certainly, it'll be a little bit different. You know, I have to tell you, my father used to tell me that I grew up asking him why the Cuban Revolution happened, even at an early age. And I have to tell you, to this date, I'm still looking for the right answer. I'm not sure there is a right answer. For you playwriters out there, journalists that are joining me, reporters, you can say this is maybe a bad comedy or a Shakespearean play with no ending to some extent. But nevertheless, I asked you to look at, or at least I recommended for you to watch The Lost City, just to give you a little bit of taste if you had not seen it. And I know I am joined by one of my high school friends and former colleague and an actor in the movie, Vic Rivers, who I know is on and watching from Los Angeles. So I'm very happy that Vic is joining us today. You know, when we talk about the Cuban Revolution, we immediately associate it with Fidel Castro. And I happen to completely disagree. And I'm going to tell you why. But however, before we get to that, I think we need to take a look where Cuba was before 1959 and what led what were the conditions under Fulgencio Batista? While most Cubans enjoy, and the country enjoy, a robust economy, one of the largest middle classes of all of Latin America, there were a lot of social and economic inequalities across the island. Corruption was at the highest level of government. And Havana, of course, as we have seen, was a playground for many American tourists. Salaries were low, and yet even today, friends of my parents that are still alive, my parents have passed away, still tell me Cuba was perfect before 1959. And I have found that was not particularly the case. We're still letting people on. The brutality and the repression of the population by Batista's secret police was brutal. And Vic Rivas in the movie The Lost City played one of the secret police. Most importantly, I argue, the part of the problem was that the foundations for a civil society were small and not well defined. Education and healthcare was good, but it was only for those that could afford it, not necessarily everyone across the island. Cuba, my friends, was far from perfect. But however, in most cases, at that time, it was better than most of the Latin American countries. The people of Cuba wanted change, yet change really did not have a complete definition. Particularly, the young university students across the island wanted change, wanted to defeat Batista. And that's how I think the Cuban Revolution started. It was led, unlike many in Latin America, the Cuban Revolution was led by the middle class, not the peasants. And it basically came, that fervor for change came from the universities, particularly two universities, the University of Havana and the University of Oriente in Santiago de Cuba. There were protests, there were civic protests by the students constantly trying to blame the regime for many of the faults that were going on in Cuba. But I want to concentrate for a minute on what I think were two key individuals that led the Cuban Revolution in its early days. And I should preface that there were many others before them, but two individuals who I think led the Cuban Revolution from the beginning. At the University of Havana, it was led by Jose Antonio Echevarria, the president of the Federation of University Students. And at the University of Oriente in Santiago, it was led by Frank Pais. Both of these individuals came from middle class, low class, particularly Pais was economically disadvantaged and his family in Santiago. But Echevarria came from a upper middle class family from a small city right outside Havana, Cárdenas. They struggle. Both of these individuals struggle to get the majority of the population involved in these civic protests against Batista. At the same time, there was another young student at the University of Havana studying law. And of course, his name was Fidel Castro. Fidel, while at the University of Havana, ran for student leadership offices and lost them all. Maybe that might be the reason why he was so opposed on holding elections throughout his days in leading Cuba. Fidel, in all honesty, never became a prominent student leader, but stayed very involved in the civic protests that were going on at that time. However, Let's look a little bit and learn a little bit more about these two individuals, Echevarria in Havana and País in Santiago. Echevarria was born in 1932. While he led many of the student protests, he failed to garner support from the general population, as I said earlier. This led him to establish, later on, an underground movement, and he became president of El Directorio Revolucionario, or the Revolutionary Directorate. The civic movement that Echevarria had led became a more violent attempt to overthrow Batista. And I'll come back in a second to Echevarria. Frank País was born in 1934 in Santiago de Cuba. He was basically concerned with the social injustice that existed at that time in the region. At the university, he became a student leader, fighting many of these causes. But he ran into the same problem that Echevarria did, and that was to garner enough support from the population. Both of these individuals became very frustrated that they could get more support from the general population. At this moment, I want to come back now to Fidel Castro. I'll come back. He led a group and basically, Fidel, I should say, led a group and basically fought in the streets of Havana. However, on July 26, 1953, Fidel, Raul, and a few other men attacked the largest military barracks in Santiago called Moncada. They failed. Those that were caught by the Batista's regime were brutally assaulted. Many of them were murdered. And Fidel and Raul escaped into the hills. For many in our history, this date marks the start of the Cuban Revolution. Not necessarily for me, and that's what I'm trying to present to you for us to consider and chit-chat about. The failure of the attack on Moncada created also a great repression in the streets of Santiago as Batista's regime looked for possible individuals that had assisted or participated in the attack on the barracks. On August 1st, Fidel, Raul, and a few other men were captured in the town of Bohío outside Santiago by Batista's forces. However, the leader of the Catholic Church at that time in Santiago de Cuba was highly respected. He also happened to be a good friend of Fidel's father, Ángel, for many years. Actually, he had convinced Archbishop Enrique Pérez Cerantes, had convinced Fidel's father to baptize the children that he had with Lina Ruz, as you guys know, out of wedlock. Archbishop Pérez Cerantes had been able to negotiate between Batista's forces and the city leaders, and he received assurances from Batista's government that if Fidel, Raul, and the rest would turn themselves in, they would not be assassinated. Archbishop Pérez Cerantes went further by taking Fidel, Raul to the public jail, which many say most likely saved their lives had they been taken to the barracks. Colonel Chavillano, who was the head of the barracks in Moncada, many believe, including Archbishop Pérez Cerantes, did not trust him or believe that he would not have honored the agreement that he had with him, and most likely they would have been assassinated. Now, a little bit of personal history, as I think some of you know. and I know my wife is on. Many of her cousins are also listening. Archbishop Enrique Perez Cervantes is related to the side of my wife. Her maiden name is Cervantes. He was the great grand uncle of my wife and the cousins, which was very interesting because, as Francis has told me many times, growing up, it was never discussed at home, or because Perez Cervantes, by some, as I mentioned, have been credited with saving the life of Fidel. In the long run, in 1961, Archbishop Perez Cervantes wrote a pastoral letter condemning the revolution and Fidel, which was read all over the island. He passed away not seeing a free Cuba in 1968. Fidel was, the trial was held. Fidel was sent to jail with Raul and the others, and some of the individuals that have helped him, and I'll mention particularly two women for you ladies listening, Aide Santa Maria, Imelba Hernandez, went to jail. However, in 1955, not necessarily the wisest move made by Batista, he signed an amnesty and released them all, at which time Fidel and the rest of them headed to Mexico to plan what next steps they were going to take in fighting Batista's forces. For the first time, Fidel met in Mexico with an individual that would influence his politics, the positions that he took, and that is, of course, Ernesto Che Guevara, an Argentinian doctor who had been going around Latin America trying to revolt people against some of what he called unfair governments. Shortly thereafter, Fran Pais, not being able to gain more support for his movement in Santiago and in the region, Frank traveled to Mexico, met with Fidel, and became his urban coordinator in Santiago de Cuba. At the same time, in 1956, Echevarria also traveled to Mexico, met with Fidel, and signed a letter of agreement, which was to this date is known as the Mexican letter. But a very interesting point I'd like to make here, because Echevarria never trusted Fidel. When he came back to Cuba, he told some of his followers, and I quote, "I just signed an agreement with God and at the same time with the devil." Echevarria continued and remained very skeptical of Fidel's intentions, as well as his own political ambitions. The plan was made for Fidel to return to Santiago. Frank Pais planned an uprising that was to be coordinated with the return of Fidel in November of 1956. Unfortunately, it did not coincide with Fidel's landing. Batista's forces were able to put it down. Fidel arrived 2 days later. Batista's forces were waiting for him. Many of the individuals that came and landed outside Santiago were captured, killed. Once again, the luck of the draw, Fidel, Raul, and others were able to go up into the hills, eventually going on to La Sierra Maestra. Shortly thereafter, Frank Pais was murdered, was assassinated at the age of 25. And the underground movement continued to supply Fidel's troops in the Sierra with food and armaments throughout the period. Now, I should say that in the meantime, going back to Echevarria, in the meantime, Echevarria and his group at the University of Havana, the directorate, started planning their next move. And their next move what took part in March of 1957. The directorate attacked the National Palace with the idea of assassinating Batista. Batista was not found. Most of the individuals, it was very poorly planned. And this is part of, I'm sure you saw it in the movie, The Lost City. Many of them were killed, captured. Some that escaped were followed by Batista's secret police. Echevarria himself at the time did not attack the palace, but instead him and a few followers went to one of the largest radio stations in Havana, Radio Reloj, with the idea of taking over the radio station and informing the Cuban people that Batista had been assassinated and the government had fallen. Now, Echevarria had, he calculated that less than 3 minutes, which became later a Soviet writer, a poet, wrote a poem called The 3 Minutes. The 3 Minutes. Once he delivered his message, Echevarria and the group headed back to the University of Havana, and on the way, they encountered some of the Batista forces, and he was assassinated in the streets. So now you have what I consider the two key figures that played a key role in the start of the Cuban Revolution out of the picture. Raul Castro, Fidel Castro kept their fighting in the mountains. And something happened very cleverly. In 1958, they were visited by, and this one is for you guys, you reporters, they were visited by New York Times reporter Herbert Matthews, who wrote a number of pieces on Fidel Castro and their movement. The articles and the reports, once Herbert Matthews came back to the States, Herbert Matthews was able to influence the American government to quit supplying Batista's troops with arms, which made it very difficult for them to continue to fight the insurgency that Fidel and Raul had now grown to many more from individuals that they have been able to recruit and continue the fight. There was a picture that the New York Times took and published, and some of you might recall, and it was a picture of Fidel, Raul, and 10 others. It was 12 milicianos, militiamen, which became known as the 12 disciples. So it became a romantic symbolism across all of Latin America and in the United States. At the same time, Fidel had told Herbert Matthews to tell the Americans back in Washington that his intention was to restore the elections and the Cuban Constitution, that he was not a communist, that all he wanted to do was improve the conditions that Cuba has suffered under Batista. You know, a couple of months ago, I was invited to a play here in Miami, and I think some of you here locally in South Florida might have attended. The Amparo Experience, written, and I believe they're also listening in, written by Vanessa Garcia and directed by Vicky Collado. I was given the part, or I was given the group, the role, and we walked into this room, and the room was El Club Náutico, December 31st. And I was telling, I've told Vanessa and Vicky, the hairs in my arms stood, because that's the club that we belong to as a family. And we often visited. I think when we go back and look at what constituted and what led to 1959, and by the way, I should tell you, the next session that we will have next Thursday, I will talk about Fidel as an individual, Raul, and some of the things that led them to, I would say, go the wrong way. Some might call it going the right way, but I call it going the wrong way or taking the wrong road. As I told Vanessa and Vicky, my favorite American poet is Robert Frost, and my favorite poem is The Road Not Taken. And to me, it was a road that they took with the expectations of bringing a lot of hope and positive changes to Cuba. And unfortunately, that was not the case. As a little boy, and I was born in Cuba. I left when I was 6.5, 3 days before Bay of Pigs. But I still remember like yesterday. I have memories of things that I shouldn't have, as I was told by mom or dad. I remember like it was yesterday, January 8th, 1959, when Fidel rolled into Havana victorious from his visit with his fight with the Batista forces. You know, when we downsized and moved to where we currently live, our condominium here in Coral Gables, on our same floor on the opposite end, Mirta Batista lived until she passed away. And of course, Mirta Batista was the oldest daughter of Batista's with his first wife. I knocked on Mirta's door one December 31st to wish her Happy New Year. And at the same time, I said, you know, Mirta, I'm getting here. I said, Mirta, I would love for one day for you to sit down with me and tell me how was that last night. And she invited me into her house. She served me some wines and we spoke for over 3.5 hours. She tells me that while she knew how ruthless her father was and how much Cuban people were suffering, there was another side of the Cuban population that lived fairly well, and she included herself. As a matter of fact, she says that evening, since she was the oldest in the family, that evening, the party was at her house. And shortly after midnight, a truck and a Jeep with some soldiers came to pick up the family and told them that they were going to their father's house in Colombia. Of course, by now, Batista had resigned and announced that he was leaving Cuba. Mita said that when they got to Colombia, She saw her father from a distance. There were two planes. They got in one plane with the family, and the other one, she said her father, stepmother, and others, security, police, military, got on it, and they fled Cuba with the clothes that they were wearing. I'll tell you a side story. After my daughter trying to get me here. Oh, there we go. A few more people. Yeah. After, thanks, Christy. After Mika passed away, and she was a very pleasant woman. As a matter of fact, I remember my mother telling me that my mother had attended her 15th or 15th birthday in Havana. Her grandson found over $1 million pesos cubanos, Cuban pesos, in a couple of shoe boxes. Indication, whichever way you want to take the interpretation. I want to conclude today by going back to what I said earlier, because for our parents' generation, for our grandparents' generation, leaving Cuba was very tough. They did not expect it in their mid-30s in the case of my parents, and I said we were lucky because my dad worked for Coca-Cola and we were transferred to Caracas, Venezuela, very different Venezuela back then. So we really didn't have a bad exile until he was transferred to Miami. But I remember asking my father one day later on in his life, I said, Dad, do you remember how many times you voted in Cuba? And he thought and he thought, and he says, you know, I can only remember voting once. I don't remember ever voting more than that. And I think the lesson that I got from that is that when you go back, even before Batista, even that we had one of the more advanced and liberal, using the word loosely, liberal and progressive constitution in 1940, Cuba lacked the foundation or the civic institutions to sustain a democratic government. We went from one dictatorship to another dictatorship, to a revolution, to another dictatorship, and many on the island, I guess, accepted it. And yet when individuals like Echevarria and País, and keep in mind, I mean, these are university students. I mean, Echevarria and País, like I mentioned, died at the age of 25. These are young students coming from middle classes, asking and demanding for change, asking for the population to join them, failing to get that kind of support from the population. And in the case of Echevarria, creating what some might call a militant organization to go underground, Directorio Revolucionario, to try in that route to bring about change, and then realizing that whether or not it was good, both of them turned to Fidel Castro to provide, I wouldn't say the leadership, but possibly a movement started on that early morning of July 26, 1953, called the July 26 movement. So with that, I'm gonna close it today. I send you guys my email If you have any questions, please send them to me. I'll try to answer them. I'm going to try to figure out how we can extend it, because I know Zoom for free, you only get 40 minutes. And that is one of the problems. I do, for you ladies that are listening in, I do want to mention 4 women that played key role in the early days of the revolution. I'll talk about them more. I already mentioned 2, Aide Santa Maria, who actually, the attack on Moncada was planned at her home. Later on, her brother Abel and actually her fiance were killed by Batista's forces. Melba Hernandez, both of these women, as I said, went to jail, but later on became pretty powerful in the inner circle. They were members of the Council of State and the Communist Party. And of course, the other 2 ladies that played significant role, and well, again, we'll talk more about them later, Celia Sanchez, who became Fidel's personal assistant, and some say his lover, and Vilma Spin, who married Raul Castro and had a number of children. But Vilma came from a very well-to-do family. Her father worked for Bacardi. Vilma, after graduating from the university in Cuba, went on to MIT and returned to Cuba to be involved in the revolution. So with that, my dear friends, I hope I leave you with some ideas to think about. And if there's an underlying point here, is that I do not believe that it was Fidel Castro that started the Cuban Revolution, but it was individuals like Jose Antonio Echevarria, Fran Pais, and many that came before them that were brave enough to challenge a very brutal government, a very repressive government that really needed to go. Have a good evening, and I'll see you next week. Talk to you soon.
Bye, Andy.
Thanks, Andy.
Lois, thank you.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank
Bye.
you, Andy.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. See you next Thursday.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you, Andy. Good job.
Very good, Dr.
Gracias,
Gomez.
Andy.
Loved it.
Loved it.
Thank you.
Fantástico. Gracias.
Thank you, Doctor.
I see one of my former colleagues, Lloyd Massner, all the way from Houston.
Andy, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I thought I had gray hair. You have more gray hair than I do.
Well, I do. I know. That's because I stayed at the same place for so many years.
I don't blame you. I know. I know.
It sounded very good, and it's obviously most interesting there. When you send out your email next time to the people who signed up, make sure that you indicate that it's Eastern Standard Time.
I think I did. I think I mentioned I put it in there.
Okay, make sure.
I will double check, but I think I put it in there.
Double check
Pedro, good
that
to
was-
be with you.
because there may be people who were confused that that are in Central or Pacific.
Yeah, I thought I had put it, but I appreciate you reminding me, Lloyd.
Yeah. Tell Christy you see if she can find another light to go on your other side there, and it'll brighten you up just a little bit there on your right-hand side.
It's not so much Christy, but you being the multimedia expert, I would tell her it was actually Francis that completely rearranged my room. There's the lady that talked me into this whole thing, Maria Elena. How are you?
Thank you, Andy.
Bye, Lloyd. See you next week. Hi, Maria Elena.
Good thoughts, good ideas. Thank you for following up and doing it.
All right, good. I'm joined, and I hope he can hear me. I'm joined by someone that I respect, that was a distinguished professor in Cuba for many years. Arturo, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Are you in Madrid?
No, I am back in California because
In California, it's good to see you.
Because of COVID-19, we have to come back. And I finished the classes last week, so they didn't give us any more time. The American Embassy wanted to evacuate every Fulbright scholar from there immediately.
How bad was it in Madrid?
How was it? Oh, it
How
was
bad?
great. How bad? Well, the COVID-19 was terrible. It was ground zero there. But you know, I spent the first 2 months were marvelous. After that, you know, it was like here, totally in total confinement.
Arturo, I'm going to invite you. I'm going to invite you. There's still people here. Any reaction to some of the things that I said, please?
I found many things interesting, and particularly let's say you asked me. I think, Andy, that the line of thought that you used was more about the insurrection.
Yeah.
But in parallel, there were some interesting dynamic from the moderate forces.
Mm-hmm.
And a question that I was planning to ask you, and I want to ask you about your email because I have the contact through Facebook. If you don't mind, I will send you the question.
Sure, by all means, yeah.
Through Facebook. But my question was about the outcome of the insurrection cannot be understood well without the failure of the moderate alternatives.
Absolutely.
And that's something that I believe.
It's a good point.
It will be very interesting to hear your point of view about that.
I'll address it next week.
At some point, you began to talk about Pérez Errantes, and the Catholic Church has several initiatives
Catholic
there.
Church, yeah.
And I expect I'm here, your guest, and I'm honored to be your.
Well, I'm honored to have you as well.
And I will simply would like to give you this type of feedback, and I
invite you to it, absolutely.
Through Facebook.
You know, like I said, Arturo, you know, I grew up asking myself, what happened? And I'm still looking for that answer. Good or bad, what happened? You know?
The only thing that I would say, it was not a historical accident.
No.
So I don't believe that it was a historical accident, but it's interesting the way you presented. Well,
you know, the last time I taught the Cuban Revolution, I have to tell you who I taught it with because you know him well, and some of you might. Jorge Dominguez from Harvard.
Yeah.
And we taught it very differently because we took it from 1959 forward. And I wanted to bring you some of these other figures because they're seldom talked about. You only read about them in books. I see Dr. Gomez, no relation to me. Hi, Carmen.
Oh, Andy, you know, I didn't realize that Fidel had tried so many times. I'm sorry, you know,
Try what?
I tried to do this so many times. Like it goes back to 1953, I guess, is what you said.
Well, the attack on Moncada was 1953.
Right.
But there were a lot of elements and a lot of things going on. It's not that he tried. I think it evolved, if you will. It evolved as a movement.
So that means, I mean, I'm thinking as you're talking, I'm thinking about my parents. So my mother and father were born in 1940 and 42. 1953, they were in, you know, middle school, high school. And so they must have known that there was civil unrest. I mean, what was it?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily.
No.
I mean, I talked at length of my parents because I had the same question, you know, and a lot of people in my parents' generation that said, no, everything was fine.
Oh my gosh.
We were not aware of all this. And yet I remember I went, Arturo, te vas a acordar, en La Víbora, I went to Los Maristas.
Sí.
And I remember, Maria Elena, I remember as a little boy that the priests would come at night to our house to change and then go out to do, you know, their things against the Batista government, you know? But, you know.
Let me give you my perspective.
Por favor, yeah.
Because I think I'm older than all of you.
Not that far.
Well, but I am.
You
So
look
I
younger.
remember my father was, he
Yeah.
had a dairy in Havana.
Yeah.
And a fairly large dairy. And so he was un empresario, a businessman.
Yeah.
That he had he bought it actually from his mother, and his grandfather had started in 1890 and all that. But anyway, so I remember my dad was very pro-American, and he told my mom in 1955, he was ready to leave Cuba. He wanted to go to Brazil. That's when
What year,
Brasilia
what
started.
year, María Elena? 19? ¿Qué año?
Around 1955.
Yeah.
55.
Wow.
55. He was sick of the debauchery. He was sick of
There you go.
how
Yeah.
bad things were in
Yeah.
Cuba,
Yeah.
the corruption. And my mom, of course, talked him out of it. And we did not leave. And then Fidel came around, and I always say, it wasn't the poor who made that revolution. It was the
middle class, upper class, yeah.
and the rich people that gave Fidel money.
We'll
to
talk about that
succeed.
next week, yeah. Oh.
Yeah, they were tired, and Fidel did fool many people. My grandmother was always against Fidel, and you know what? My father had huge fights with her, and he would call her, oh, eres una batistiana, and we need this change, and da-da-da. They had huge fights in my family in the late 50s because of that, because she and both my grandmothers were against Fidel. They said that's communism. Again, my grandmother was very Spanish.
I think, if I may, I think that was part of just the nature of us. I mean, we were against this, we were against that, we were against this. But what I have found throughout the years, that involvement, like Echevarria or País, as I mentioned, trying to bring about change, whether positive or negative, most people sat on the sidelines.
Yes, Andy, exactly. They were apathetic.
Most people sat on the sideline. And Arturo, you've heard me say this. I'm concerned right now, María Elena. I think, María Elena, you heard me say this too. I'm concerned now, today, that after 61 years here in South Florida, many Cubans suffer from what I call Cuba fatigue. They're tired. Not only are they tired of the subject, and I'm not going to say they don't care. We do care. But it's a different type of caring, because as I've told my colleagues when I travel to Cuba, at my old age, unfortunately, I'm not going to go live in Cuba for a number of reasons. And as I tell them, I am not here on the island to impose on you what you should do. You guys need to decide what you want to do, whether you want to continue the same way or bring some changes. We in exile will decide whether we support it or not. But the majority of us, I don't know. I don't think we're going to go. But my biggest concern right now is Cuba fatigue among our generation, and then our children. Well, in the case of me, my daughters and my sons, they know, my son-in-laws, they know, because we're talking about it. I'm sure, Carmen, you too, María Elena, Pedro, I don't know you, but I don't know if we're tired, or we say, after 61 years, what the hell? Pedro.
He's on mute. You have to unmute.
So Pedro's on mute.
Well, dale.
Now,
Unmute.
For sure, there are uncertain feeling that we can't move anything. Just to do it, certainly cultural resistance and prepare another step. But that is something to study what's happening in the young generation, because there are something in the common of ideas. It doesn't work. Esto no sirve. But what can do it? That is something interesting, because that fatigue, that are something that we study to figure about how to get it, and necessarily in which order, where to look forward. But there are so many reasons that Spanish philosopher call it la intrahistoria, that we have to think about it, because there are so many clues where to go for. But I think that is something to talk about as a leader, But that's an idea, that's a concern, where to go, how to get it, and next step, how to do it. That's a classical.
this is my personal beliefs, and I've discussed it, I think, with most of you, or some of you. And of course, we have my colleagues in Cuba and we have many differences. Right. And we have a lot in common at the same time. But I think we made two mistakes. I made two mistakes. Let me blame me. I made two mistakes. My parents made two mistakes. The first mistake was to deal on the issue of Cuba here in South Florida. Right. North of Orlando, very few people knew good or bad about Cuba. That's why anytime I was invited to speak at a university across the United States, I would take the invitation and go. The second point, whether we agree or disagree with what Fidel did or not, let's put that aside. Right. We isolated the Cuban people. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We isolated the Cuban people. And after so many years, now trying to build bridges, respect differences of opinions, put our Cuban passion aside, right, if you will, que nos domina todo, you know? Right. Nos ciega, it blinds us, it blinds us. Putting that passion aside, forget whether Republicans and Democrats. I asked the question, I don't know the answer. Is there an opportunity down the line or the possibility for a reconciliation between us, and I hate to call them them, but those on the island? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. Because there's still on this side many memories of not just the atrocities of Batistas and before, but many memories of what the Fidel regime did during those early days and throughout. So there's still quite a bit of animosity, if you will. But can we forget those? I mean, after all, there's 11.3 million people on the island, and roughly we're a little bit over 2 million here. So, you know, is that opportunity exists? I don't know. I don't have that answer. But now I can tell you, te voy a decir, the times that I have traveled to Cuba, once they find out that I'm Cuban, born in Cuba, particularly, I feel at home. I'm embraced by the Cuban people. Really? We disagree a great deal on what's going on, right? But sorry about that. But I feel at home, and yet I know that that will not be my home at retirement, which also is very sad. You know, well, it's very sad. It's very.
What
sad.
I want to say is, you know, the el exilio has gone through so many stages.
Exacto, Maria Elena. Yeah.
You know, and you and I are from the 60s.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And at that time, people were so focused on freedom, and they were so scared of being in Cuba. Okay, because remember at that time, the reason we left is because my father was scared that he was going to lose control of his kids, of his daughters. Okay, because Patria Potestad, it was going to be the government. It was the communist ideals. So everybody, that's why Pedro Pan and, you know, the freedom flights and all that mass exodus, the first mass exodus, that was one stage. Okay, then after that, then you have the Mariels and you have the everything else that has happened but our generation, you and I that came at that time, you know, I grew up in Tampa. I didn't come to Miami in the 60s. I always lived in Tampa. And after, I've said that on Facebook, after Bay of Pigs, and my dad was part of it, he said, we're not going back to Cuba. Right. So we have to keep our life here. Right. We have to look forward. Whereas in Miami, everybody was going to go back to Cuba. Mira, when my son was born, mi hijo de la vejez, in 1989 in Virginia, and we came back in December of '89. That's when the Berlin Wall fell and all that. All my friends at my son's baptism, we're going to Cuba next summer. We're going to be in Cuba next summer. Okay, so even in '89, they were still thinking of, in Miami, the mentality in Miami was to go back. And obviously, you know, I was the sarcastic or the cynic because I never thought we were going to go back. I challenged them, and and one of them is our friend Mercedes Sandoval, because she was at my baptism. At the baptism, they go, Mercedes, we're not going to go back to Cuba. I'm sorry, it's not going to happen. And I was right. So you know, so you know, there've been all these waves and waves of exiles.
We forget
different mentality.
We forget that the majority of the Cuban American community today in South Florida came after 1990.
Exactly. Yeah, and we're dying, you know, our generation.
With a different perspective, because many of them came already with the experience of growing up in Cuba, you know. So, but that's the majority.
I know what is not my case.
Yeah, exacto. Yeah.
Yes, I'm 42. You know, I'm 42 or 43, and I remember actually. And I'm coming with a certainly without feeling, and I'm changing it now because I discovered, and my generation has so many friends with the same feelings, that we are more Cuban than anything, both at the same time. We discovered something that is different to the Cuban belongings that in Cuba the government put it on ourselves. That is something interesting to keep in mind in our generation, you know, person with my age that are coming constantly. There are so many generations in the exile, there are so many generations in the belonging feeling. I want to try to explain better, but I think that I can to give it that idea, that feeling. That is something so interesting for us in South Florida.
I have to tell you something that happened to me. My first trip to Cuba, which was in 2001, we were dealing here with the Elian Gonzalez case in Havana. It was a group of academics. I was the only Cuban American born in Cuba in the group. And I remember Arturo at the University of Havana in El Aula Mate. I arrived a little late because I was coming from somewhere else, but once I was introduced and they found out that I was Cuban, born in Cuba, as you can imagine, the students wanted to focus, and from Miami, by the way, and from Miami.
Classical Cuban.
They wanted to find out, you know, and I was being very careful, as I always am. Because again, I am not there to tell people what to do, and that's not my role. My trips to Cuba has been to learn and to listen. I come back and I make my own opinions, as I've discussed with you guys. But I had a young University of Havana student at the end when we went to the Q&A. I had a young University of Havana student get up and ask me, I think was a very simple question, which we addressed today. What are your thoughts on the Cuban Revolution?
Simple question.
Yeah. How am I going to answer that? And I think, as I told Vanessa Garcia and Vicky Collado the other day in a Zoom meeting that we had, literally, the thing that came to my mind after thinking for about 30 seconds was Robert Frost's poem, "The Road Not Taken." And when of course, then I had to explain what the hell that meant.
I think that was a good line in the class today. This was a good line in the class today.
Yeah. So we'll take it up next week, and we'll take it. Arturo, I hope you can join us.
Andy, do you see the chat? Are you able to see the chat?
Yeah.
People can comment, can submit questions also in the chat.
Yeah.
Can you see that? It says Zoom group chat.
Yeah, I see it. Carmen.
Yeah.
At old age, I'm still, that's why I had Christy here, because of the technology.
Every week.
I'm going to do it on Thursdays, Arturo, at 7 o'clock Eastern time.
Okay.
Okay.
So I will check your Facebook, and I see the.
Okay.
The idea.
I'm trying to get Arturo to join. Not Arturo, Carlos to join us from Havana.
Is it always the same ID and password, or does it change every week?
That's a good question.
I don't know. I will let you know. I hope not. I hope not.
You let us know.
Can you hear me, Andy?
Who's this?
This is Maggie. I'm sorry, my video is
Maggie,
not
how are
working.
you?
I'm very well, thank you. My video is not working, which is just as well because I look a sight. But and I missed.
remember you when you were younger, Maggie, as I'm sure Marilena does too, so don't worry.
Well,
He's my neighbor. We live on the same street at lockdown.
Don't worry,
we live on
Maggie.
the
I
same
remember
street.
you as you were.
Well, you know, it goes back to my University of Miami days with Jaime Suchliki and my mother working there. But
Yeah.
my original post had to do with the Constitution of 1940 and the events that led to el golpe de Estado, etc. So that's what I was sort of expecting the thing to go, not with
I didn't want to go back, and I consulted with some of Hugo de Aragon from FIU, now retired, and he said, Andy, are you going to cover colonial republic?
No, pero
I can't go back. I can't go back in such a short period of time. And you know what, Maggie? I also have a lot of young people. Which is great. My daughter's generation. I even have sons and daughters of some of my friends that decided to come on. So I needed, and a lot of people that are not Cuban. So I needed to find a balance, which,
it was great.
If you
and Dr. Gomez, it was excellent.
It was not easy. It was not
excellent.
Since the whole beginning of the whole problem, it was the coup of 1952.
Yeah.
Because without 1952, there would have been no 26th of July.
Yeah.
And so that's what that where the problem lied, because sure, there were many factions to the 26th of July movement, and but anyway, we can
remember that even after Fidel, and we'll talk about even after Fidel came into power, el directorio, which were not in the Sierra Maestra, where they were in the Escambray Mountains. Okay, they did not want to give up power. They did not. They wanted to stay in power, and the directorio in the Escambray Mountains split, and one side went with, remember, Menoyo, who lived in Miami here for many years and then returned to Cuba and died in Cuba. So el directorio, like Echevarria said, I signed an agreement with God and the devil at the same time.
Yeah.
Right.
Like I said, this. Some people call it, this is a Shakespearean play with no ending.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Good night.
All right. Good night. Thank you.
Andy, love you. Okay.
All right.
Good night.
Night.